In the 20th century, few leaders divided opinion as fiercely as Fidel Castro. To his admirers, he was the comandante, the rebel who gave Cuba its dignity, defied the United States, and brought free healthcare and education to millions. To his critics, he was a dictator, a man who silenced dissent, clung to power for half a century, and left his people trapped in poverty. Hero, tyrant, revolutionary. His life story is one of daring raids, jungle warfare, Cold War standoffs, and unshakable will. This is the saga of Fidel Castro, the man who changed the fate of a small Caribbean island and shook the world. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on the 13th of August 1926 in Baran, eastern Cuba. His father was a wealthy landowner from Spain, his mother a household servant. Though born into privilege, Fidel was restless, headstrong, and ambitious. At the University of Havana, he studied law, but more importantly, he discovered politics. Havana in the 1940s was a city of contrasts, gleaming casinos run by American mobsters, and slums where ordinary Cubans struggled. The young Fidel joined student movements, took part in street battles, and immersed himself in nationalist and anti-imperialist ideas. Even then, one thing was clear. Castro wasn't just another student activist. He had charisma, an iron will, and an unshakable belief that history had chosen him for greatness. Cuba in the 1950s was, on the surface, a tropical paradise. American tourists flocked to its beaches and casinos. But beneath the glamour lay poverty, inequality, and corruption. In 1952, General Fulgencio Batista seized power in a coup. Backed by the army, the mafia, and U.S. business interests, Batista's regime was ruthless and greedy. For many Cubans, democracy had died overnight. For Fidel Castro, the coup was a call to arms. He believed Batista's dictatorship could only be overthrown by force. On the 26th of July, 1953, Castro and 135 rebels attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Poorly armed and outnumbered, the assault ended in disaster. Dozens of rebels were killed, others tortured. Castro was captured and put on trial, but in court, he turned defeat into prophecy. For 4 hours, he defended his actions, denounced Batista's corruption, and outlined his vision of a just Cuba. His closing words became legendary. "Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me." Sentenced to 15 years, he would serve only 2, released under an amnesty. Castro left prison, but he had found his mission, revolution. Exiled in Mexico, Fidel gathered exiled Cubans and plotted Batista's downfall. It was here he met Ernesto Che Guevara, a young Argentine doctor whose radical zeal matched his own. The two became inseparable comrades. In December 1956, 82 men set sail from Mexico aboard a small yacht, the Granma. Overloaded and battered by storms, they reached Cuba's coast, only to be ambushed. Most were killed or captured. Just a dozen rebels survived. Among them, Fidel, Raúl, and Che. Bruised but unbroken, they retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From this unlikely refuge, they would build a revolution. For 2 years, Castro's rebels fought a guerrilla war. They struck quickly, vanished into the jungle, and relied on peasants for food and shelter. But Fidel understood something more powerful than bullets: image. Journalists were invited to the mountains, leaving with stories of idealistic rebels fighting tyranny. Radio rebelled, the rebel station, spread their message across Cuba. Every small victory eroded Batista's crumbling regime. By late 1958, Batista's army was collapsing. On New Year's Day 1959, Batista fled Havana. Days later, Fidel Castro marched into the capital, cheered by thousands. The revolution had triumphed. Castro's new government moved fast. Foreign-owned businesses were nationalized. Land was redistributed. A literacy campaign sent thousands of young volunteers across the island, teaching peasants to read and write. Within a year, Cuba's illiteracy rate had plummeted. For many poor Cubans, Fidel was a savior, but the elite, the church, and U.S. businesses were horrified. Castro's Cuba was turning red. In 1961, the CIA trained and armed Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. They landed at the Bay of Pigs and were crushed. The humiliating failure only strengthened Fidel's image as the David who defied America's Goliath. But the showdown wasn't over. In 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. The Soviet Union installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The U.S. demanded their removal. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath. The crisis ended when the Soviets backed down. but Castro had secured his place as a Cold War giant. Castro saw himself not just as Cuba's leader, but as the standard-bearer of global revolution. He sent Cuban doctors, teachers, and, when needed, soldiers abroad. In Angola, Ethiopia, and beyond, Cuban troops fought in wars far from home. Che Guevara became the symbol of this crusade until his death in Bolivia in 1967. His martyrdom only deepened Castro's legend. At home, life under Castro was a paradox. Healthcare and education were free, and Cuba boasted some of the highest literacy rates in the world, but political freedom was crushed. Opposition parties banned, critics jailed. Thousands fled across the Florida Straits. The U.S. embargo, tightened year after year, strangled Cuba's economy. Shortages became part of daily life. Yet Castro, dressed in his olive green fatigues, remained defiant, a permanent revolutionary. By the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost its greatest ally. The economy plunged into crisis, yet Castro endured, adapting, tightening his grip, and rallying his people with endless speeches. But age eventually caught up with him. In 2008, he handed power to his brother, Raúl. On the 25th of November 2016, Fidel Castro died, aged 90. Fidel Castro remains one of history's most polarizing figures. To millions, he was the giant who stood up to American imperialism, who gave Cuba dignity, education, and healthcare. To others, he was a tyrant who denied his people freedom and kept them under his rule for nearly half a century. But whether saint or sinner, one truth is undeniable. Fidel Castro changed the course of the 20th century, and his shadow still lingers over Cuba, the island of revolution.